The man showed up on a Friday evening in October of 1998, walking up the gravel driveway of Owen Shepard's farm outside Brookston, Indiana, with a broken fan belt in one hand and nothing else. His name was Arthur Dees. He was 62 years old. His farm was 11 miles north. His Massey Ferguson 3070 had thrown the belt on the county road an hour earlier, and he had walked the last mile and a half to the nearest farm with lights on, which happened to be Owen's. Owen was 41 years old. He had been farming his family's 480 acres since his father's stroke in 1991. He did not know Arthur Dees well. They had spoken maybe 4 times at the elevator over the years, the kind of brief conversations that happen between farmers who are aware of each other without being close. Arthur farmed 620 acres to the north. He was known, loosely, as a serious operator who kept to himself and maintained his equipment carefully and did not ask for things he didn't need. He was asking now. He stood in the driveway holding the broken belt and said he was sorry to come unannounced and that he needed a fan belt for a Massey Ferguson 3070 if Owen happened to have one, and if not, a phone to call his son. Owen said, "Come in the shed." He had 3 fan belts that might fit. He kept a stock of common belts because the nearest parts store was 22 miles away, and a breakdown during planting or harvest could not wait for a 22-mile round trip. He tried the first belt. Too short. He tried the second. It fit. He gave it to Arthur without being asked what it was worth. Arthur said, "What do I owe you?" Owen said, "Nothing. It's a belt." Arthur said, "It's not nothing. What do I owe you?" Owen said, "Come back with your tractor and we'll put it on together. That's what you owe me." Arthur drove his truck back to the county road, retrieved his tractor, and returned to Owen's shed. They put the belt on in 40 minutes. Arthur started the engine. It ran. He thanked Owen again and offered again to pay. Owen said again that there was nothing to pay. Arthur nodded. He drove home. Owen went inside and finished his dinner. He did not think of it as a significant evening. He had given a neighbor a belt that cost him $4.40. That was the entirety of what he had done. He did not know that Arthur Dees had been watching. Not watching that evening specifically. Watching for years. Arthur Dees had been farming in White County since 1963. 35 years. He had seen farmers come and go, seen operations expand and collapse, seen the farm crisis of the 1980s take neighbors he had known since childhood and leave their land in the hands of banks and corporate buyers, and the particular silence that follows when a family farm stops being a family farm. He had developed, across 35 years, a specific sense for the character of farming operations. Not based on acreage or equipment or yield reports, those numbers were available to anyone who paid attention, but based on the smaller things. How a man maintained his fences, whether the equipment coming out of the shed in the morning was greased or not, whether a farmer who was asked for something gave it without making the asking cost more than it should. He had seen both kinds of farmers. The ones who made the asking cost, who tracked favors as debts, who measured every transaction in the specific currency of what they had given versus what they would eventually receive. Those farmers built operations that ran on a kind of bilateral accounting that required constant maintenance. Every favor recorded, every debt called eventually, the community reduced to a ledger that nobody enjoyed keeping but everyone felt obligated to maintain. And then there were the others. The ones who gave the belt without calculating what it was worth, who fixed the fence along the shared line without sending a bill, who showed up in September when a neighbor needed an extra set of hands and did not mention it in October when they needed something themselves. Those farmers built a different kind of community, one that did not run on ledgers because the transactions were not the point. The point was the neighbor. The point was the farm next door still being there 20 years from now, because the people around it had treated it as something worth supporting. Arthur had been watching Owen Shepard for 7 years, since Owen had taken over the farm after his father's stroke. What he had seen was consistent. Owen maintained his equipment correctly. He kept his fences. He paid his bills at the elevator and the co-op without dispute. He planted on time and harvested clean and did not leave grain in the field when he was tired and the day was long. He was, in Arthur D's assessment, the kind of farmer who would still be farming in 20 years when other operations around him had sold or failed. The belt confirmed it. Not because giving away a $4 belt was a remarkable act of generosity. It wasn't. But because of how Owen had handled the asking. Arthur had been prepared to be made to feel the weight of the request. He had walked up a stranger's driveway at dusk with a broken machine and an empty wallet, and he had known, from 35 years of experience, that the reception could go several ways, and that some of them would cost him something beyond the belt. Owen had not made it cost anything. He had said, "Come in the shed," and tried the belts, and given the one that fit, and proposed the arrangement. "Come back with the tractor, we'll put it on together." That transformed the favor into a shared task, which is the specific way that a man of Owen's type handles a favor. He does not make the person receiving it feel the weight of obligation. He distributes the obligation across a task that both people can participate in, and the task becomes the thing, and the favor disappears inside it. Arthur Dees drove home that night and told his wife Margaret what had happened. Margaret said Owen Shepherd seemed like a decent man. Arthur said he'd been watching him for 7 years, and decent was the right word, and also not quite sufficient. Margaret asked what he meant. Arthur said he meant that Owen was going to need something someday, and that when he did, Arthur intended to remember the belt. Margaret said, "That seems proportionate." Arthur said it wasn't about proportion. It was about the kind of farming community that existed when people operated that way, and the kind that existed when they didn't, and which one he intended to contribute to. Margaret said she understood. She had been married to Arthur for 40 years. She usually understood. Arthur Dees farmed his 620 acres through the late 1990s and into the 2000s with the focused discipline of a man who has been doing something correctly for a long time and sees no reason to change the approach that made it correct. He maintained his Massey Ferguson fleet, 3 tractors and a combine, all of them older, all of them in better condition than their age suggested, because Arthur maintained them the way he maintained everything, with attention and without shortcuts. He had no equipment debt. He had no land debt. The last of it had been paid in 1994. His operation was, by the measures that matter to a farmer who has survived 3 decades of agricultural economics, solid. Not large, not flashy, solid. In 2004, his son Robert came back to farm with him. Robert was 34, had spent 10 years working in agricultural equipment sales in Indianapolis, and had come home because his father was 68 and the farm was there, and Robert had understood somewhere in his mid-30s that the farm was the thing that mattered, and that it would not wait indefinitely for him to arrive at that understanding. Robert had opinions about the equipment. He thought his father's Massey Ferguson fleet was too old, and that the maintenance costs were approaching the point where replacement would be more economical than continued repair. He said this once, carefully, in the way that a son who respects his father says something he expects to be disagreed with. Arthur listened to the full argument. Then he said, "The fleet is paid for, and it runs. Show me the numbers where replacement pencils out, and we'll talk." Robert showed him the numbers 3 weeks later. They did not pencil out. The capital cost of replacement, even with used equipment, exceeded the projected maintenance savings over any reasonable planning horizon. Arthur looked at the numbers and said, "Good. Now you know why we maintain what we have." Robert said, "I know why. I just wanted to make sure you knew I'd looked." Arthur said, "I know you looked. That's why I gave you time to do it." The Massey Ferguson fleet continued. Robert learned to maintain it the way Arthur maintained it, by the service manual, by the hour meter, by the specific sounds and feel that a machine communicates to a person who is paying attention. By 2007, Robert could diagnose a hydraulic problem from the sound of the pump the way Arthur could. By 2009, he was doing the annual engine inspections without supervision. Owen Shepherd had not thought about the belt since the evening he gave it. It had been a $4 belt and 40 minutes and a repair done in a shed on a Friday night, and it had left his mind completely by the following Monday, replaced by the 1,000 other things that a farming operation in October requires of the man running it. He was aware, in the general way that farmers are aware of their neighbors, that Arthur Dees was doing well. The fields to the north were always clean, the equipment always looked maintained, the grain always came off on time. These things were visible from the road, and Owen noticed them the way he noticed everything about his operating environment, not with particular attention, just with the steady awareness of a man who is always reading the landscape around him for information. In 2006, Owen had a difficult year. A wet spring delayed planting by 11 days. A dry August reduced his corn yield by 22% below projection. A hydraulic cylinder on his primary tractor failed during harvest. A catastrophic failure, the rod bending under load in a way that took the machine out of service for 4 days while he sourced parts from a dealer in Lafayette and waited for delivery and installed them himself because the dealer's service bay was backed up and he could not afford to wait. He managed. The farm survived 2006 the way it survived difficult years, through the specific financial resilience of an operation that carried no excess debt and had reserves adequate for bad weather and equipment failure. But the 4 lost harvest days had cost him yield, and the hydraulic repair had cost him money he hadn't planned to spend, and the 11-day planting delay had set the whole season back in ways that compounded through to November. He did not mention any of this to Arthur Dees. He did not mention it to anyone except his wife Linda, who kept the books and already knew. He did not know that Arthur Dees knew anyway, not the details. But Arthur could read a season from the outside with 35 years of practice, and he could read an operation, and he had been reading Owens for 13 years, and he could see the shape of what 2006 had been. Arthur called Owen in November of 2006. He said he'd had a reasonable year, and he wanted to know if Owen needed anything going into the winter. Owen said no. He was managing. Arthur said he understood and that the offer was open and to call if that changed. Owen thanked him and said he would and didn't call. Arthur expected that. He hadn't called expecting Owen to accept. He had called because Owen was the kind of farmer who would not accept help he didn't strictly need. And Arthur respected that. And offering was the right thing to do, regardless of whether accepting was likely. He filed the conversation in the same part of his accounting where he had filed the belt in 1998. In the spring of 2011, Arthur Dees was diagnosed with Parkinson's disease. He was 75 years old. The diagnosis came at the end of a winter when he had noticed tremors in his right hand that he had initially attributed to cold and then to age, and finally, reluctantly, to something that required a doctor's opinion. The doctor's opinion was unambiguous. The disease was in its early stages. The progression would be manageable for a period, and then it would not be. Arthur told Robert, he told Margaret, he told no one else for 3 months. In those 3 months, he did 2 things. He continued farming. It was spring, the ground was ready, and the Massey Ferguson fleet needed to be in the fields, and it was in the fields, and he made decisions about what came after. The farm would go to Robert. That had always been the plan, and Parkinson's did not change the plan. What it changed was the timeline and the structure. Arthur needed to transfer operational control to Robert in a way that was gradual enough for Robert to absorb it fully and rapid enough to be completed before the disease made the transfer involuntary. He began that process in the summer of 2011, deliberately, without drama, handing off decisions one by one in the way that a skilled operator hands off a machine. Not all at once, but progressively, letting the new operator develop confidence before the handoff is complete. Robert absorbed it correctly. By the fall of 2012, he was running the operation. Arthur was present, visible, available for consultation. But the decisions were Robert's, and everyone who dealt with the farm understood that. In the summer of 2013, Arthur's condition became more visible. The tremor in his right hand was apparent. His gait had changed. He drove the farm roads in his truck, but did not operate equipment. He sat in the shed in the mornings while Robert and his hired man prepared the machines for the day, and he watched the preparation with the specific attention of a man who has done something for 50 years and can no longer do it but still understands it completely. He thought about Owen Shepherd during those mornings, He thought about the belt in 1998. He thought about the November call in 2006. He thought about what he had told Margaret, that it wasn't about proportion. It was about the kind of farming community that existed when people operated a certain way. He called Robert into the shed one morning in August of 2013 and told him what he wanted to do. Robert listened. Then he said, "All of them?" Arthur said, "All of them." Robert said, "Dad, I know what it is. It's what I want to do with what I've built. Are you going to tell me I can't?" Said, "No, I'm going to help you do it." Owen Shepherd was in his equipment shed on a Tuesday morning in September of 2013 when he heard the first truck turn into his driveway. He walked to the shed door and looked out. It was a flatbed carrying a Massey Ferguson tractor. He did not recognize the truck. He walked to the driveway. The driver got out and said he had a delivery for Owen Shepherd from Arthur Dees. Owen said he wasn't expecting a delivery. The driver said he understood that and that he had paperwork if Owen wanted to see it. The paperwork was a transfer of title. One Massey Ferguson tractor, Owen's name on the receiving line. At the bottom, a note in handwriting that shook slightly at the edges of the letters. "Owen, you gave me a belt in 1998 and wouldn't take anything for it. I've been meaning to settle that account. This is a start." "Arthur," Owen read the note. He looked at the tractor on the flatbed. He looked at the driver. He said, "A start?" The driver said, "There are more coming." Owen stood in his driveway while the driver unloaded the first tractor. Then the second truck arrived. Then the third. Through the morning and into the afternoon, flatbeds came up his driveway carrying Massey Ferguson equipment, tractors of various models and years, a combine, planters, tillage equipment, each with a transfer of title, each with Owen's name, each with the same note or a variation of it in Arthur's shaking handwriting. By the end of the day, 100 pieces of Massey Ferguson equipment were parked in Owen Shepherd's fields and his lot and along his driveway. The inventory that Arthur Dees had accumulated across 50 years of careful farming and careful buying and careful maintenance, every machine paid for, every machine maintained to the standard Arthur had applied to everything, was now Owen Shepherd's. Owen called Arthur that evening. Arthur answered on the third ring. Owen said, "Arthur, what did you do?" Arthur said, "I settled a debt." Owen said, "A fan belt." It was a fan belt. Arthur said, "It wasn't the belt, Owen. It was how you handled the asking. I've been watching farming communities my whole life, and I know what they look like when people handle things the way you handled that Friday night, and I know what they look like when they don't. I built something across 50 years in this county. I want it to stay in hands that handle things the right way. Your hands are the right hands." Owen was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "I don't know what to say to that." Arthur said, "You don't have to say anything. Just farm them right." Owen said, "I will." Arthur said, "I know. That's why they're there." Arthur Dees died in February of 2017. He was 81 years old. He had farmed for 54 years. His obituary in the Monticello paper ran 4 paragraphs and listed his survivors and noted that he had been a lifelong farmer in White County. It did not mention the 100 machines he had given away in September of 2013. It did not mention Owen Shepherd. It mentioned that Arthur was known for his careful stewardship of the land he farmed and the people he farmed among. Robert Dees attended the service and spoke briefly. He said his father had believed that a farming community was built from the accumulation of small decisions made correctly across years, that the character of a county's agriculture was not determined by its largest operations, but by the daily choices of the people running the smallest ones. He said his father had spent his whole life trying to make the right small decisions and had trusted that they added up to something. Owen Shepherd sat in the third row. He did not speak. After the service, he shook Robert's hand and said he was sorry. Robert said he was glad his father had known Owen. Owen said he was glad too, although he was not sure he had earned the distinction. Robert said, "My father was not a man who gave things to people who hadn't earned them. If he thought you'd earned it, you'd earned it." Owen drove home. He pulled into his driveway past equipment that had not been there 4 years earlier. The Massey Ferguson fleet that Arthur had assembled across 5 decades and maintained to a standard that showed in the condition of every machine. He pulled into his shed and sat in his truck for a moment. He thought about October of 1998. The man walking up the driveway at dusk with a broken belt and an apology for coming unannounced. The second belt that fit, the 40 minutes in the shed, the $4 he had not taken. He had not been doing Arthur a favor that evening. He had simply been doing what the situation required. A neighbor needed a belt, and Owen had one, and giving it was the obvious and ordinary thing to do. He had not thought about it afterward. He had not expected it to be remembered. Arthur had remembered it for 15 years. Owen got out of his truck and walked through the shed. The Massey Ferguson equipment was maintained and running and ready for the season. He had farmed it carefully since September of 2013, the way Arthur had asked him to, the way he would have farmed any equipment he was responsible for. He kept the service logs. He maintained the schedules. He knew each machine by its hours and its history and its particular mechanical character, because that was how you maintained equipment and how you honored the person who had maintained it before you. He picked up his grease gun and started his morning rounds. Outside, the fields that Arthur Dees had watched for 15 years were waiting for another season. The Massey Ferguson fleet that had crossed those fields across 5 decades was ready to cross them again. And the community that Arthur had believed in, the one built from small decisions made correctly, from belts given without conditions and debts settled without expectation, was still there in the gravel driveway and the shed and the 40 minutes on a Friday evening in 1998 that had started something neither man had planned, and both of them, in their different ways, had honored. The grease gun made its rounds. The morning came on. The work continued. It always did.